Welcome to the podcast, Paul and David.
Great to be back, Jackie.
Thanks, Jackie.
Paul, recently we've been hearing that the no case is now leading in several national polls ahead of the October 14 referendum. And just this week, you uncovered some of the tactics behind this apparently very successful campaign, and they're fairly controversial. So, can you tell us about what you discovered about some of the no campaigners?
Yeah, so we wrote a couple of stories this week based on a leaked recording of a no volunteer session run by the group called Advance, which is a right-wing kind of political campaigning outfit that's running the formal no campaign separate to the Liberal Party. And I think the reason it kind of kicked off a fair bit of debate this week was because it illustrated what a lot of people suspected the no campaign is trying to do in the community. It showed that the national campaigning chief, a fellow called Chris Inglis, who's a long-time Liberal Party staffer, is instructing thousands of volunteers who are making tens or hundreds of thousands of calls into persuadable households to kind of play on people's fears and emotions and to implant doubt in their mind about the potential risks of the voice. It's not extremely unusual for political campaigners to try and play on emotion because emotions are powerful. But I think the reason it, as I said, sparked debate was because there has been this criticism in the No campaign that they are fear-mongering from Labor and Voice backers, and this went some way to proving that they are trying to implant fear in the community's mind.
Paul, can you tell us a bit more about the campaigning chief, Chris Inglis? You just said he's a former Liberal Party staffer. What do we know about him, and what do we know about the group he's heading up, Advance?
We don't know a heap about him, and we don't know a heap about a fair few of the people who are involved in this organisation called Advance. Advance it was called Advance Australia when it spawned in 2018. It was created as a kind of counterweight to the left-wing outfit called Get Up, which was quite a well-known body at the time, which has since become quite weak. Advance Australia had a pretty slow start to life. I think, David, you reported on them in the 2019 election. I don't think they haven't had a really big national moment until this referendum campaign. They use quite similar language to kind of right-wing US politicians and the Republican movement in the US. They talk about woke politicians and the radical left-wing agenda that they're trying to fight in Australia. They hold big political rallies in the suburbs where kind of hairy-chested conservative rhetoric is used. A lot of their figures kind of speak on Sky News programs at nighttime. We don't see them feature in kind of mainstream commercial media debate during the day. They're opaque. It's really hard to find any details about Chris Inglis, this fellow we're talking about, and Matthew Sheehan, their leader online. They don't really have online profiles. They're a difficult group to penetrate, but they're having a huge influence on this referendum campaign.
And my understanding from your reporting is that a big part of the No campaign they're running is reaching people by phone, but not telling them they're actually from the No campaign. They've got thousands of volunteers in New South Wales and Victoria who are making nightly calls to households in Tasmania and South Australia. So can you tell us a bit about these phone calls? And if they're not saying they're from the No campaign, what is the premise that they use when they ring people up?
Yeah, so phone calling in political campaigns has been around for a really, really long time, but I think something that I found interesting from this briefing that we watched was how much import the No campaign places on these calls as a tactic to persuade voters. They say that on a good night, if they get a lot of people at a phone banking session, they can call up to about 20,000 people just from one session. And they've narrowed down the voter base to target about 3.5 million voters in a few key states. So if they have a few weeks or months of solid phone banking, they believe that each person who is called, on average, is 4 to 11% more likely to vote for their cause. So if you scale that up, that's a lot of people who you could bring into your camp. Part of what we also learnt from this briefing was that the scripts that these phone callers are taught to read out when they speak to households begins with the phone caller introducing themselves as being from a group called Fair Australia, which is the name that this advanced group has given themselves for this referendum campaign. They're explicitly told not to say that they are from the No campaign. That they're not told to say that they are thinking of voting no, and they're told not to tell voters to vote no. What they are told to do is to raise the prospect of controversial policies such as reparations, treaties, and various other Indigenous advancement policies that have caused significant debate in this referendum campaign. They're told to tell voters that they have heard of these prospects from friends, and that they're simply concerned citizens who are calling your house to let you know about the things that they have heard.
Right. So they're not trying to ask questions or anything. They just say, look, I'm just ringing up to discuss the referendum in general, and here's some stuff I heard about it.
Yeah, the extent of the questions they ask are things like, have you also heard similar things? Have you heard from your friends about what this Indigenous activist is pushing for? Does this bother you? It's done in a kind of soft way to not scare a voter who might still be undecided, but rather to make them ask questions that will, as I said, and in the words of Chris Inglis himself, plant doubt and fear into the mind of a voter in a soft way.
Yeah, and it sounds very cosy and conversational, the way they're going about it. David, since these tactics from the No campaign were made public by Paul this week, the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, has been called upon in Parliament to condemn the campaign, and in particular its claims about financial reparations. Can you tell us about that? What claims are being made about financial reparations, and what has Dutton said in response to being called upon to condemn these tactics?
Well, he certainly hasn't condemned the tactics. And some of his frontbenchers have actually insisted that these claims are right or fair. Now, what Paul's just stepped through is really goes to the heart of it. It's asserted to people as a doubt that's out there. Fair Australia, according to these scripts, is not telling voters there will be reparations. It's something like, have you heard that there's concern about this? And of course, the reparations word is a very powerful word. Reparations raises the idea that the federal government, funded by taxpayers, has got to make enormous payments to Indigenous Australians simply because they're Indigenous Australians. Not just to pay for education and welfare and health, but, compensation payments for land dispossession. The pay the rent phrase is very powerful because it seems to suggest that your private property is no longer your private property, and you've got to make a payment yourself to Indigenous elders. That's some of the stuff that's circulating online. So these are all very powerful. Getting back to the key thing that was in Paul's story, it taps into emotion. It's very emotional.
David, not too long ago, Linda Burney called out the No campaign for importing what she called American-style Trump politics to Australia. So do you think these revelations about the No campaign support that claim?
Yes, I do. I've been talking to academics, experts, people who've been looking at what's happening on social media. And I do think we've got to be wary of immediately assuming that this is all Trumpist politics at work. We see misinformation and disinformation in every election campaign. It's not new that there are false claims circulating in this national vote, but I think the scale is different. It's on a new level. Advance Australia has learnt from tactics in the US, and I don't think they're particularly worried if they get fact-checked in the mainstream media. We've been doing stories in our mastheads about false claims. We've been saying they're false, we're checking them, and then we're reporting them. That doesn't really matter when you're working in an online world where you want to speed these false claims around from mobile phone screen to mobile phone screen. They move much faster than a fact-checking organisation. So they're not really too fussed about what's happening in the mainstream media, only in the sense that they can take a clip from Sky News and then put it on social and make it go viral. A couple of years ago, and this is according to the Australian Election Study, most voters started getting a lot of their information about elections from social media, from the internet. So for all the debate about what's in the mainstream media, it's very clear that the real battle here is happening online.
And Paul, last month the Australian newspaper detailed a cheat sheet for Yes volunteers who were seeking to shift sentiment through phone calls as well. And according to that report, it instructed people to, quote, name the villain or unfair barrier, including who or what is harming us and why. Pick a villain that most people will dislike or trust. And you also reported this week that some Yes campaigners from the union movement are instructed to tell people that the No side is, quote, vilifying Aboriginal people. Do you think both sides are using grubby campaign tactics sort of equally, or do you think what the No side is doing is a bit different of a higher order?
I don't think grubby is necessarily the right word. The tactic of kind of playing on people's emotions is it's not new. I think the question that arose this week and that people have been debating for weeks and months now is whether the No campaign is putting false or spurious claims into the community and then seeking emotional reactions after doing so. The Yes campaign would argue that they're playing on emotion, sure, but the emotions they're trying to play on are hope and, a sense of national unity and positivity, whereas they would argue that the other side are playing on the opposite, more reactionary base instincts in people's minds.
And David, I want to dig into the Yes campaign a little more, and in particular some comments made by Indigenous leader Marcia Langton this week. So this week she was accused of calling all No voters racist and stupid, although that's not exactly what she said at all. Can you tell us about those comments? Because this news all played out in a very unharmonious way in Parliament, and there was a lot of debate about it, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was a lot of debate about it, and her remarks kind of prove the point that we've been talking about here, because once her remarks were in the mainstream media, they were picked up, and then headlines about her quotes were then spread on social media to undermine the Yes campaign. So it's very important. Marcia Langton, Indigenous leader, a key author or co-author of a report that led to this voice proposal, was speaking at an event in Western Australia. She was asked about compensation and reparations, and she made an argument about the No case that said when you get to the heart of their argument, be worried about Indigenous people getting money, a lot of it is based on racism or sheer stupidity. Now, her words were about the No case. But once that was picked up in a Western Australian newspaper and then by the Australian newspaper, shortly before question time, a report emerged saying that she said no voters were racist and stupid. Very powerful headline, picked up in question time, and a question was put to Linda Burney about that. It shows the importance of fact-checking when everything is moving at phenomenal speed in this referendum. So I called Marcia Langton and I said, "What did you say?" And she said, "I did not call voters racist and stupid." She certainly was calling elements of the No campaign, calling them out for using tactics that she thought played on racism and stupidity. But now, of course, it's turned into a bigger issue because on the No side, they're going through everything that Indigenous leaders say. They're going through everything that Marcia Langton has said. And Marcia Langton can be acerbic at times, and she's made some fairly sharp remarks about opponents, including the No campaign leader, Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price. So it becomes a sort of a war of words over who said what. Certainly, there are remarks that Marcia Langton has made where she says some No voters, are motivated by racism. There's a past remark from her where she said that might be true of about 20%, maybe what she called the hard No voters. Mm-hmm. So she's calling out what she sees as racism in the debate, but it's interesting and it's important and it's almost inevitable. This then is used against the Yes campaign. It's one of those situations where it's easy to fear that we are going to go into a spiral of competing personal abuse and attacks on key individuals rather than a debate over the concept itself of the voice.
Yeah. And on that, I'm just interested in your views on this because, I think we can probably agree that the debate has gotten nastier this week and it's gotten a little bit more ad hominem. And we found out about some of these tactics. So what I want to ask you is, it seems to me that the nastiness of the debate generally is most likely to benefit the No campaign, because watching a bit of feud play out like this sort of taints the whole concept of the voice and its supposed positivity and its hopeful nature, and will turn people off it. That's just my view. What do you guys think?
Well, I think that that's right, and I think it's one of those immense challenges for a referendum like this. The yes case has to present a positive message about this change that it says will benefit Australia. The no case has an easier task. It only has to convey a negative message, and it's doing that very effectively. And there is division over the voice. I mean, we have reached a situation where the basic proposition is not uniformly accepted by Indigenous Australians. A lot of the most effective campaigning by Fair Australia quotes Indigenous people who do not want the voice. And so that sense of division over the core proposition is playing to the advantage of the no case. That's just one of those basic facts about this referendum. And I think negative campaigning is proving to be incredibly effective.
Paul, what do you think? Is the rancour of the debate going to assist one side more than the other?
I think David's right. It clearly diminishes the whole project because this thing was meant to be unifying. The country is split in half. It's extremely divisive. So if the purpose of this from Anthony Albanese was to unite the country, even if it wins, it's hard to see how that's been achieved. To the point about Marcia Langton, I think it's highlighted something that's been a key problem from day one for the Yes campaign, in that the key leaders who drafted the wording of the voice, who have been pushing for this for years, have made a litany of comments throughout their career and even now that when brought to life in political debate are seen as controversial because they're not politicians. They're not using guarded language. Some of them have very radical ambitions for Indigenous reconciliation that are not kind of within the frame of what is seen as acceptable in political debate and seen as acceptable to mainstream Australians. So because they're not politicians and they're at the forefront of this debate, they're saying things that are actually harming their own cause when heard by mainstream voters. And this is a risk that Labor's taken on from day one and hasn't ever really ameliorated.
Thank you both very much for being with us today.
Thanks.
Cheers, Jackie.